So I'm going to begin with a question. It's probably not the best question, but here it is. Why are people who've had too much to drink inclined to make bad decisions? Why are people who've had too much to drink inclined to make bad decisions? You want to take a guess? Somebody said, well, because they've had too much to drink. Well, that's a good guess, but that's not it. So I want you to think about it. We've all heard the stories. Some of them are funny. Some of them are not so funny. And some of them, well, they're just still kind of fuzzy. We're not really sure what happened. And now some of those stories are your stories. And to be honest with you, unfortunately, some of those stories are my stories. Now, I asked that question because there doesn't seem to be a connection between having too much to drink and making good decisions. I mean, I've never heard anybody say this, and I bet it's safe to guess that you've never heard anybody say this either. It's a good thing I was drunk, otherwise I might have made a bad decision. Yeah, I don't know of anybody who's ever said that either. So back to the question. So what's the connection between having too much to drink and poor decision making? Now, you may know this, but alcohol increases the norepinephrine that in our brains. And what it does is it kind of acts like a stimulant. And we know what stimulants do, right? Stimulants increase impulsiveness and decreases inhibition. Alcohol, in other words, temporarily impairs the activity of our prefrontal cortex. And you know what that is, right? It's that part of our brain that allows us to connect the dots, to think rationally, to make good decisions. So what happens is alcohol liberates a person to act without thinking, it makes them feel brave when they shouldn't feel brave. It makes them loud when they should be quiet. It makes them think that they can do things that they would otherwise know that they couldn't do or shouldn't do. I'm going to give you an example of this from my earlier life. We used to go four-wheeling. And when I'm saying four-wheeling, I'm not talking about with ATVs or these side-by-sides. I'm talking about with real trucks. I mean, real men play with big, real toys, right? And I'm not talking trail riding. I'm talking mud bogging. So here's a picture to give you an idea of what I'm talking about. And there's a story behind this picture, and I want to tell you, but this is what it looked like when we used to go mud bogging. So here's the story behind this picture. This was a place down in Providence Forge where just people would just randomly show up on the weekends. We called it the Hole, and it was there was power lines that ran through this swamp, and the goal was to see how far you could make it through that swamp, or if you could get further than everybody else. And some days we would show up some weekends and it would be muddier than others after maybe a good rain. And as you can see from this picture, on this particular day, it was pretty muddy. Well, there was this one guy who had, well, let's just say he had a little bit too much to drink. And all of a sudden, he's up on the hard, dry ground, and you hear this truck starting to rev up, and he starts blowing the horn, and people are turning around looking at him, and they realize that what he's about to do probably isn't the wisest thing to do, but they back up and give him space to do it. He hits the gas, he takes off, and leaves ground, and gets about 6 foot in the air, and launches out into the mud, thinking that if he could get enough air and enough speed, he could go further than anybody else. Well, all that happens was he's got all this momentum, and he hits the mud, and that's as far as he goes. He stops immediately. And yes, these two guys were riding in the back of his truck when he did it. Now, normally what would happen at that point, once you got as far as you could go, somebody would bring out a chain or a winch cable, and they'd hook it to the back of you and pull it out. But everybody knew that it was probably safer just to leave this guy where he was for the moment. In fact, it wasn't very long, to be honest with you, till he fell asleep in the front of his truck. And again, it was probably the best thing for him at that moment. Now, where am I going with all this? Well, back to the question. What is it that, that makes people who've had too much to drink not be able to make good decisions? Well, the answer to that question is this: they can't. They can't. They can't make good conscious-based decisions. It's not that they're ignoring their conscience. It's that there's no conscience there for them to ignore. In fact, it's been switched off, if you will, at least temporarily. Now, what does this have to do with you and me? What does this have to do with you and me, sober-minded people? Well, I'm glad you asked that question, and I'm going to get to that in just a moment. But first, let's just review for a moment. So we're in a series called Better Decisions, Fewer Regrets, that's based on Andy Stanley's book by that title. In this book, Andy is asking 5 questions, or proposes 5 questions that you and I should ask ourselves when making decisions so that we can make better decisions that will lead to fewer regrets in our life. And let me just say, this is a great book to have. If you do not have this book in your arsenal, in your toolbox, you need to have it, because while we're going through this, it's just a great tool to have to reference later. So I know I've read the book at least twice already myself. Here's why I think it's a good book for you to have. Here's what we have a tendency to do when it comes to making decisions in our lives. We tend to justify our decisions, when what we should do is clarify our decisions. Well, again, what we tend to do is we justify the decisions that we're about to make. Instead, what we should be doing is clarifying our decisions. And the best way to do that is to do this: to ask sincerely, to answer honestly, and act accordingly. When it comes to these questions that we're looking at, if we will take the time and ask sincerely ask ourselves these questions, and then pause long enough to answer honestly, and then act accordingly, act according to the information that we have, it will lead, I can promise you from personal experience, it will lead to better decision making and fewer regrets in our lives. So, let's jump into today's question. This is the 3rd question in Andy's book, and Andy calls it a conscience question. A conscience question. And the question looks like this: Is there a tension that deserves my attention? Is there a tension that deserves my attention? Now, this is something that we've all experienced, from kids to adults. We're getting ready to make a decision. We're getting ready to finally decide and move. And just as we do, something happens. There's something just doesn't feel right. There's tension. There's something that makes us feel uneasy about the decision that we're about to make. We're uncomfortable with it. I call it a red flag moment. And it's that moment where you're about to make a decision, something doesn't feel right, and so you hesitate. Now listen, we do this as adults, but I've also watched my grandkids do this. They're getting ready to make a decision. They're getting ready to do something, but something just doesn't feel right. And I've watched them hesitate before they do it. Now that doesn't mean they don't always go ahead and do it, just like with us. But we notice we've had that tension. Or maybe you're about to make a decision and you're moving toward it, and there's no tension at all until somebody out of nowhere maybe asks a question or points out something that you hadn't thought about, and all of a sudden where there was no tension, now there's tension. Maybe your best friend is like, "Hey, can you really afford that?" Or somebody says, "Hey, what is your wife going to think about that?" Or what is your husband going to think about that? Or better yet, what will mom and dad, how will they react to the decision that you're about to make? And so all of a sudden, where there was no tension, now there's tension. And so, I think of all the people who ask these questions, moms are great at this, aren't they? They're great at asking these kind of questions. I was thinking about this as I was preparing, and I remember back many years ago when I was about to marry Lynette. We were busy making plans, and one day out of nowhere, my mom walks up and she says, "Hey, can I ask you a question?" And I'm like, "Sure you can, Mom." And she says, "Are you sure?" "What do you mean, am I sure?" "Are you sure that this is the direction that you want to go? And I was like, well, where are you going with this? She said, well, I'm really asking, are you over? And this girl that I had dated for many years and prior to marrying Lynette, and she says, are you sure that you're over her and you're ready to do this? And so directly and immediately to her face, I was like, oh yeah, that's old news, man. We that happened years ago. And but later on, I got to be honest with you, that question kind of stopped me in my track, and it made me really sit down and go, okay, am I sure? And I'm glad that she asked that. It didn't change my decision, but it really solidified my decision. I knew beyond a shadow of a doubt that this was what, so I was glad that she asked me that question. So here's the deal. You're about to make a decision and there's tension. So here's the question. What do we do with that tension? What do we do with that tension? Well, here's what you don't do. You don't ignore it. In fact, the last thing that you want to do is ignore it. You owe it to yourself to wrestle with this question, to wrestle with that attention. You owe that to everybody around you to do that. So here's what I offer that you do with attention. You let it bother you until you know why it's bothering you. You let it bother you until you know why it's bothering you, so that you can make better decisions. Again, the last thing that you want to do is ignore it, because we know this, and Trey's talked about this over the last couple of weeks. Every decision that we make impacts more people than just us. It impacts others around us. And can I also offer this? Our regrets don't just impact us either. Our regrets impact others as well. And so the last thing that we should do is ignore it. Now we know that, but how many times have we done just that? How many times have we ignored it and later regretted it? How many times have we said, I wish I had just taken a little bit longer and paid attention to that tension that was in my life. I wish I had just thought through that a little bit longer. We've all done it. And so, again, I offer, let's let that tension bother you until you know why it's bothering you. Now, there's a story in the scriptures that really illustrates this point. And it's found in 1 Samuel chapter 24. If you want to follow along, you can turn there, or maybe you can read it later. I'm going to do more of telling you, narrating the story, than we are going to look at it verse by verse. But the story involves one of ancient Israel's most famous kings, or maybe I should say one of the would-be king. We are first introduced to this would-be king. In fact, he would be the second king of Israel. His name is David. When we're introduced to David for the very first time, David's a very young teenager, and he's a shepherd boy. He works for his dad, and he attends sheep. One day, a prophet shows up at David's house and announces to David's family and to David himself that God has picked him, God has anointed him to be the next king of Israel. But the problem was, Israel already had a king, and his name was Saul. But Saul wasn't a very good king. In fact, the longer that he was a king, the worse he became at it. And one of the reasons that Saul became so bad at being a king is because he wasn't paying attention to the tension that was in his life. One day, while Saul and his army are out in a standoff with the Philistines, David shows up. His brothers are fighting for Saul and Saul's army, and he shows up at his dad's request to bring food to his brothers and to check on them and see how they're doing. And when he gets there, there's this standoff between these two armies. In fact, there's a giant from the Philistine side who is challenging the Israelites, and nobody wants to take that challenge. And so maybe you know the story. David steps up to the challenge, and he defeats the giant. He cuts the giant's head off. And from that point on, David becomes a hero. And not just any hero, David becomes a war hero, the best kind of heroes. And from that day forward, David would become a household name. Everyone would know what David had done. For a while, David served King Saul. But Saul grew very jealous of David to the point that he tried to kill him. In fact, he made it his point that he would kill him. And so David has to flee for his life. But by this time, David had gained a following. There was a group of men who often would follow David into battle as he would fight battles for Saul, and they began to really trust David. And so when this happened, they were like, listen, if you're leaving, we're leaving with you. We believe in you. We trust you. And so on that day, David and this group of men become fugitives. One day, Saul gets some reliable intel as to where David and his men are hiding out. And so Saul puts together an army of about 3,000 men, which in that day and time was a pretty good sized army. And they head off, they go out to the desert of En-Gedi to put an end to David. Saul's goal is to kill him. By this time, Saul has also learned that David has been anointed to be the next king of Israel, which only adds to the jealousy that Saul already had of David. And in fact, Saul had other plans. His plan was that his son Jonathan would succeed him on the throne. Well, as the story goes, Saul knows the general whereabouts of David and his men. And as they're making their way through this rugged, hilly terrain, the desert of En-Gedi, Saul gets the call. No, it's not a call of saying, hey, Saul, we know exactly where David is. It was a different kind of call. It was the call of nature. The call of nature. Now, there was no restrooms, no rest stops in the desert. There were only caves. And so Saul brings his army to a halt. He climbs down off of his horse. He picks out a cave, and he climbs the hill, and he goes into this cave as the story says in 1 Samuel 24, to relieve himself. Now, if you know the story, this is where things really get interesting. Of all the caves that King Saul could have picked to take care of business, he picked one that was already occupied. Unfortunately, these caves didn't have the doors on them or the little latch that you slide over that says occupied. Unknown to Saul, David and a group of his followers were hiding in the very cave that Saul picks. They were waiting for Saul and his army to pass by so that as they passed by, they could exit the cave and go the opposite direction and escape Saul's army. Now, talk about providence. Of all the caves that Saul could have picked, he chose this one. He chose this one. Now imagine how David must have felt at that moment. David had intel that Saul was coming. He knew that Saul was on his way, and so David had split the men up and hid them in different caves and different places around the desert. And so as he and his men see Saul coming, they advance or move to the very back of the cave. And as they do, they're watching the mouth of the cave, and in walks Saul. Now Saul walks in blinded by the sunlight of the desert. He walks in just far enough into the cave where he can get some privacy. He takes off his outer robe, he lays it on a rock or the ground there beside him, and he lifts up the rest of his garments, and I don't know any other way to put it, but then he squats to pot. All right? Now, this is either a divine appointment for David or just dumb luck for Saul. Either way, here's David's chance to become king. Kill the king, become the king. You know that he has to be thinking that. After all, he had been anointed to become the next king. And you know he's got to be thinking about that. Now, if he wasn't thinking about it, the men who were in the cave with him, sure, they were thinking about it, because here's what they whispered to David. David, this is the day. Look what God has done. This is the day the Lord spoke of when he said to you, I will give your enemy into your hands for you to deal with as you wish. So if David wasn't thinking that, his men were definitely thinking that. David, man, could it get any better than this? Do this and we can go home. No more running, no more hiding, no more fighting. We can go home and be with our families and enjoy life once again. So David begins to crawl toward Saul. And he moves closer and closer. But as he gets closer, something's not right. Something begins to bother David. And there's a hesitation on David's part. There's tension that begins to build in him. In fact, the story says that David became conscience-stricken. Something was bothering him. There was tension there in the decision that he was about to make. David wrestles with this tension, and he begins to think, is this really what I want to do? Is this really the story that I want to tell with my life? That I took advantage of the king while he was relieving himself, and I killed him so that I could become king? Is this the story that I want to tell my grandkids? Grandpa David, tell us again how you snuck up behind David while he was going to potty and you killed him so that you could become king. You see, this is kind of the legacy question that Trey introduced to us last week. Is this the story that I really want to tell with my life? Is this really how I want to become king? How can I do this? David began to think. After all, it was God who put Saul on the throne. God had picked Saul to be the king. So how can I do this? So as he crawls even closer, David is paying attention to the tension. And just as he reaches Saul, David changes courses. Now, this is where you and I fit into this story. You see, David really had no idea how the story would unfold if he killed the king. He had no idea. He could not be guaranteed that if he killed the king that he would become king. So let me ask you this. Ever make a decision only to find yourself disappointed? We all have, haven't we? You know what disappointment is? It's really just another word for regret. You know how it comes about? Well, we think that we can control the outcome of our decisions. But then when we find out that we can't, it only leaves us disappointed or filled with regret. Disappointment, again, is just another word for regret. You see, this is what David realized at this moment. This is what the tension was all about as he approached Saul. I could do this, David is thinking, but it will, there's just no guarantee. So maybe there's a better story. Maybe there's a better way. Maybe there's a better story that can be told here with my life. He believes that there is. And so instead of killing Saul, he reaches over and he grabs the royal robe that Saul had laid there, and he cuts a corner off of it. And then he backs silently back into the back of the cave. Now, David's men, they just can't believe what David has done. And they're like, David, what are you doing? Do you see what just happened? Do you see the opportunity that God gave you? But David disagreed. In fact, here's what David said. He said, the Lord forbid that I should do such a thing to my master, the Lord's anointed, or lay my hand on him, for he is the anointed of the Lord. So while his men are like, they just can't believe the decision that David made, that he didn't take the opportunity. They're like, well, listen, if you won't do it, then we will do it. To which David sharply rebuked his men and did not allow them to attack Saul. And it says, and Saul left the cave and went his way. Saul exits the cave, climbs down the cliff, gets back on his horse, and just as he's about to give marching orders, Saul hears somebody calling out his name. King Saul, King Saul. And Saul begins to look around, and as he does, he looks up to the cave that he just came out of, and there stands David. And he recognizes something in David's hand. He's like, that looks like a piece of my robe. And so Saul checks his robe, and sure enough, David had cut a corner off of it. And at that moment, Saul realizes just how close he was to losing his life. David then bows down before Saul in honor and respect of him. And then he stands back up and he makes this speech, and once again, everyone knew who was the better man between him and Saul, because they knew Saul would not have spared David's life. Saul would have told a totally different story. But David chose to tell a better story with his life. And he was able to do so because he was paying attention to the tension that was in his life. He was paying attention to the tension that was around the decision that he was about to make. And because he did that, he was able to tell a better story. So let me just kind of end this as abruptly as I can to get to the point. David did become king, but not because he killed King Saul. And you can read the rest of that story in the Bible. So let me ask you this. Is there a tension going on in your life? Are you experiencing a tension right now that deserves your attention? Is there a tension that deserves your attention? All of us experience this, and maybe you're experiencing it right now. So let me ask you, what tension are you wrestling with today? Seriously, what tension are you wrestling with today? If you are, then let me offer this. Let it bother you until it no longer bothers you anymore. And I say that because if you'll do that and you'll wrestle with that until you figure out why it is that it's bothering you, it'll lead you to make a better decision. Let me ask you another question, maybe a different group of people. Is there a tension that you're ignoring in your life right now? Is there a decision that you're about to make and you know there's tension there and you probably should hesitate, you should probably wrestle with it, but you're choosing to ignore it? If there is, let me just remind you, do you really want to make another poor decision? Do you really want to be disappointed again? Do you really need another regret in your life? Then let me encourage you to wrestle with that. Let it bother you until it doesn't bother you anymore. And so you're saying, well, how do I figure that out? Well, sometimes it's just as simple as sitting down with somebody else and talking it out. Hey, here's a decision that I'm thinking about making, but I'm wrestling with it, and I'm not really sure why there's tension there, but can you help me maybe figure this out? And I'll be honest with you, sometimes just talking it out, hearing yourself talking it out loud will help you identify what the tension's all about. Maybe you need some professional help. Then go see a counselor. Let them help you figure that out before you make another decision that's only going to lead to another disappointment, that's only going to lead to regret. Listen, I've ignored the tension in my life way too many times. In fact, I was trying to think, well, what story could I tell to illustrate what I'm thinking about? And the list was long. But I want to tell you that the one that I chose goes back a long time ago. Lynette and I had been married for just a couple of years, and we hadn't applied for and gotten a credit card yet, and for me there was tension to get one, to be honest with you. And even though I knew we couldn't afford it, and if I charged on it, there was no way we could make payments. I mean, that was the whole reason you got a credit card anyway, was to afford the things that you couldn't afford. And what you don't think about is the payments then that comes after that you can't afford to make. But anyway, I justified my decision. I got a credit card, and boy, did I regret that. In fact, that decision didn't just affect me, but affected Lynette. It affected our relationship, and it would affect our boys in the years to come. Because you see, it took me years to work myself out of that huge mistake. And that's often the way it works, doesn't it? We make a decision, we ignore the tension, and we pay a huge price for it sometimes. And so let me encourage you today, if there's a tension in your life about a decision that you're about to make, let it bother you until it no longer bothers you. Let it bother you until you know why it's bothering you. And let it help you make a better decision. Would you pray with me? Father, I thank you for the way that you've created us. Lord, we have these internal warning signs sometimes that you've placed within us. That God, that just signals to us when we're about to make a poor decision. And so, Father, I pray that we would pay attention to that. Lord, we've all made decisions that didn't turn out the way we thought they would. And God, we were left disappointed and we were left with regrets. But God, we can do better. God, if we would just pay attention to the tension that's in our lives when it comes to making decisions. God, I know from personal experience, from learning from those mistakes, God, to pay attention to that red flag, that hesitation, that whatever it is that's just not right about the decision that I've made. And God, I'll be honest with you, there are times where I didn't always understand and I didn't see it until the other side of choosing not to move forward. So God, I just pray for that person or those people who right now are wrestling with some decision in their life. Maybe they don't understand the tension. But God, that they would trust you. Because God, at the end of the day, that is you at work in their life, trying to protect them, trying to keep them from being disappointed, trying to keep them from another regret. God, help us to become better decision makers. And Father, I thank you again for your Holy Spirit that you give us as believers, that works within us, that not only, God, points out when something's not right, but leads us in a better direction. God, help us to pay attention to that. And I pray and ask this in Christ's name. And we all agreed together and said, amen. Hey, listen, I hope that you will come back next week as we continue this. We're going to look at another question next week. It's called the maturity question, and it's a big one. And so I hope you'll come back next week and be a part of that. Have a great day. Have a great week, and we'll see you next Sunday.